Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining. This is our webinar on variable annuity and life insurance companies. Get the skill set for XBRL. I want to thank all of our speakers that are joining us today. But first, I'd like to thank one of the sponsors to our program. The Insured Retirement Institute has been helping us educate their members by bringing this event to them. The Insured Retirement Institute is the leading trade association for the insured retirement industry. So thanks. I want to thank them very much for participating with us on this and partnering. We have 4 speakers with us today, and I'm going to ask all of them to bring on their videos so we can introduce them. First, we have Nikki Berteau. Nikki is Disclosure Product Analyst at Broadridge Financial Solutions. We also have Michael Boyle. Mike is XBRL Manager at Donnelley Financial Solutions, also called DFIN. We also have Guy Stanzione, Compliance Services Director at Topan Merrill, and Scott Tice, CEO of NovaWorks. And Scott is also the chair of the XBRL US Domain Steering Committee. So thanks everybody for joining us today. Just a couple of logistical points to make here. If you have any kind of technical issues as we go through the program, please send us an email at support, S-U-P-P-O-R-T, at xbrl.us, and we'll do our best to get you back online. And then also want to mention that we are offering CPE credit for the program today. So if you've signed up for it, or actually even if you haven't signed up for it, but you'd like to get it, please make sure that you respond to the poll questions, which we will be doing at 2 different points during the session today. Okay, with that, I'm going to turn over and we'll take a look at the agenda. Here's what we're going to be covering. First, I'm going to start off a little bit with XBRL fundamentals. Scott Tice is going to give us a bit on the fundamentals. We know that many of you may be somewhat new to XBRL, and so we just want to give you a little bit of background on that. Then the basics of the rule is going to be covered by Guy Stanzione from Topan Merrill. We'll then be taking those 2 CPE poll questions, and then we're going to go on to XBRL tagging review from Mike Boyle at Donnelley Financial Solutions. And finally, workflow and resources, which is going to be brought to us by Nikki Berteau from Broadridge Financial. And then we'll have those final CPE questions. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Scott Tice, who's going to talk to us about XBRL fundamentals.
Thanks, Michelle. And as Michelle mentioned, some of you might get bored to tears with this because if you're a provider, you've been experienced with this and have probably already heard this a couple of times because we've been doing a number of different training sessions here. Next slide, please. But hopefully you'll find something that'll come out of it if you've seen it many times. Yeah, the problem here, and I've been involved with this since 1984. Wow. Is that you originally had a lot of paper. Everything was in paper. It was very difficult to search. I remember the old SEC public viewing room in DC. It was kind of an exciting place to be at, actually. And but you couldn't do searching. In the 90s, we ended up having the operational EDGAR system, and that gave us text. And eventually, we had PDF and HTML. A lot easier to search, but not reliably machine readable. Anything that was going to parse through that had to make a lot of assumptions about the data and could be easily fooled by things being formatted a little bit differently or using different labels for things. So clearly a method was needed to identify data in a flexible manner that makes it reliable in a way that you can at least assume that the data is going to always be correct as the disclosure was made. Next slide, please. So the solution to this was XBRL, or Extensible Business Reporting Language. XBRL is more than just a format. I mean, you think of formats like CSV, comma separated values, or Excel, or JSON. Most of those formats don't really bring any structured intelligence to the data. XBRL does, on the other hand. It is a self-described data model. And it doesn't just describe points, it describes relationships, it describes what that data can be, the authoritative references, and et cetera. It also has many levels for validation, from the data type being a date or a monetary value or a text block. Those are self-validating, and plus you can do additional validations with things like Zool and Formula. In many cases, the submitted data is also used by analysts for educational institutions and individual investors to build their own models. Those models then in turn can be used from quarter to quarter or filing to filing and peer groups to make determinations about the state of the registrant or the filer. Next slide, please. So what makes XBRL different? As I mentioned, CSV or JSON, JSON is JavaScript object notation, is it's self-contained and self-describing. When you take the data and mix it together with the model, you have something that basically stands the test of time and can be read by any machine that understands XML. The taxonomy describes the data model, relationships, documentation, authoritative references. So XBRL is often referred to as structured data. You'll hear that term occasionally. Next slide, please. So if we look at data, just in general, we'll take a table here. This is actually out of a FERC filing or Federal Energy Regulatory Commission filing, but it applies universally. Every fact or data point that's in there will have additional data behind it, such as what is the actual concept? What data type is it? What kind of documentation is there? And documentation can be fairly expansive. You can have multiple roles for a particular kind of concept. What is the entity that it belongs to? So if I mix this together with a lot of other entities, I know that it belongs to, in this case, Pacific Gas and Electric. What period is it? What unit? US dollars, Canadian dollars, etc. And then when you disclose this data, generally you're disclosing just the information that's highlighted in red there. If it's plain XBRL, for inline XBRL, which VIP is, you'll actually be disclosing the stuff around it and then marking the data that's going to be XBRL. Next slide, please. So where is this stuff used? If you're not familiar with it, it's used by the SEC now for quite a while in numerous different areas for Corp Fin and investment management. Early on, it was used by the FDIC. I think they're in their second generation now for filing reports. FERC has been using it for a year, and that's gone very well. And there's a lot of non-governmental organizations using it and private industry, things that you'd never see or be able to get access to. But it allows many things like in the surety area for applicants and for people who are insured to send over information to the surety that and analyzes that and determines whether or not it's still within the whatever risk parameters you have. And there's a lot more, and it's being used worldwide for countries basically around the globe. I don't know what the number is at this point, but it's very popular, and there's a good reason why. Go forward, please. So let's talk about the taxonomy. The fundamental building block of the taxonomy is the concept. It's frequently known as an element. That's kind of an XML-ism because when you look at how the things are tagged, it uses an element name, but in iXBRL, it actually just names it as a concept. The taxonomy defines the concept, their characteristics, and the relationships to other concepts. For example, things that are part of a table will have an abstract or a heading associated with it. You know, those particular items will be then grouped under other items. So there's a hierarchical relationship, and you can also go across as well. Each concept then has properties like its data type, as I mentioned before, monetary or a date or a string. A period type, is it a instant or a duration type of a concept? Balance type. Some of the properties aren't used in all situations. Concepts also have related documentation, what we call labels or authoritative references or references. And those too can have a lot of flexibility with respect to the kind of data that's put into them. Next, please. So when we look at a taxonomy, this table probably should be turned like an upside down tree where you have the top or entry point, sometimes called. Then you'll have various tables or presentations. Each of those will in turn define different axes that can be used in that table, the line items, abstracts, and then concepts. So if you look at a simple one like VIP, I think there's only a couple different presentations that are default in there. If you go to US GAAP, there's many, probably a couple hundred. In addition, there's over 18,000 concepts. Next slide, please. So if we look at what we see with inline XBRL, and I'm showing here just a cover page of an 8K, with conventional HTML in the browser, I'll see a conventional 8K cover. On the right, I have an inline version of that. It's the same exact document, but in this particular case, the inline viewer is highlighting that information that can then be exported or further explored and lets the consumer understand what the data actually is. Next slide, please. And we can elaborate that then by taking a look at the securities registered pursuant to section 12, da, 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 da. We can see the first thing is what are the attributes associated with this concept? There's the name DEI. Again, if you're not familiar with these things, that's the SEC's taxonomy for document entity information. And then what particular concept, securities exchange name, the fact content, that is NASDAQ. Even though it says NASDAQ Global Select Market, it actually comes out as NASDAQ, what period it applies to, and then what type of data it is, and then what is the transformation that's used with inline XBRL to get to a more computer readable version, and that is exchange mean. The next thing is the labels. This has two different labels. It's got documentation associated with it, and it has the actual label for the concept. Usually you'll have a default label. When you're looking at face financials, you might see things like negated, total, etc. And then we have references associated with it. With taxonomies, if you're used to things like GAAP, again, GAAP doesn't have references, but other things with the SEC do have references, and that allows you to tie this to particular rules and have some authoritative references with respect to that. Next, please. So a couple key terms to start thinking about. You have the concepts, then you have facts, and you have context. So the concept we just talked about that's defined by the taxonomy, facts are part of the instance submitted to the regulatory agency or to the SEC. That is one of the things that you're going to be submitting. That'll be additional with your filings now. Contexts are part of that as well, and they define periods and other dimensional information that are part of that instance. So it would be, say, the current period instant as of the end of 331 at 331, or duration from 1/1 all the way to 331. Next, please. So the instance is a collection of that information that's represented as your XBRL disclosure. So it contains those contexts, those periods, and it contains the data items, again, those facts. And they have to be unique as defined by that intersection of the context and the concept. Next, please. So what gets filed, and this varies depending on the application, but you're always going to file your instance. For inline XBRL, that happens to be your HTML document, except now it's XHTML. It also needs to be well structured. So if you're using a vendor that you're not sure about, you're going to want to make sure that they're making pretty good HTML, because you used to be able to get away with murder with respect to how badly coded HTML was, and the SEC didn't care as long as it followed their tagging guidelines. Now with XHTML has to be well structured, and that inline XBRL is embedded as part of that, which the browsers ignore unless you've got something to read it. The schema, and this is an XML term or a database term, that is going to define your any of your extensions and other items, and also define what taxonomy you're using underneath. And when you file those things, those are exhibit 101, sometimes 104, but almost always 101. And your type would be ex101.sch. There's a particular naming scheme that's outlined in the Edgar Filer Manual. And then finally, link bases. Those are things that basically describe labels and presentations and definitions that you have that you're doing over and above what's part of the taxonomy. Again, exhibit 101, and that'd be like lab for labels and pre for presentations. These need to be specified. I'm not sure about VIP, but most of the rules require it to be in the exhibit index, just like any other exhibit. Next, please. So where can you find more information? Well, first of all, Regulation ST is the governing rules that has to do with Edgar. If you have the main rule, like we're dealing with VIP here, or pay versus performance, or GAAP, all those come down from regular SEC rules. But Regulation ST is what governs the disclosure of electronic information, and part of that is the Edgar Filer Manual. Edgar Filer Manuals come out 4 or 5 times a year. The area that is of interest for XBRL is Volume 2, Chapter 6. It's not for the faint of heart. It is extremely technical. Your vendor should be taking care of that stuff, but it's got important information in it. For particular taxonomies, and today we're talking about the VIP taxonomy, the SEC issues a taxonomy guide. And what I sit in those that run the domain steering committee right now, we want taxonomy guides for everything. I'm glad to see the SEC does this. And you can take a look at that, and we'll be covering one of the selected areas of that later on in the presentation here. But that is how you actually prepare your documents, what data goes in XBRL. You can go to the SEC website. There's an XBRL section. Actually, there's a couple of different sections. And then XBRL US has a lot of information. And of course, you can go to whatever vendors, agents, law firms, et cetera, for additional information as well. There's lots of stuff out here. So today we're focusing specifically, though, on VIP. And next slide, and I think that does it for me. And I'm going to go ahead and pass it off here to Guy Stanzione from Topan Mirror. He's going to go through some of the basics of the rule. Thank you.
Thanks, Scott. And for those of you that are petrified already, when I turn it over to Mike Boyle, he's going to show you in more detail, what that sample that Scott showed you on the screen a little bit ago, what a tag document looks like. But when you look at VIP, and we know the majority of you folks on the call have never been exposed to XBRL, it brings up a whole range of questions. So Michelle, if you don't mind going to the next slide. And here's just a few sample questions that have been asked of us over the last few months, because this is now the focus of the variable product issuers. What are the documents? What are the filings? What content needs to be tagged? And we'll go over that in more detail. And Mike will talk about that, as well as Nikki, when we get into the last section of workflow and the process. Are there certain products that are required to be filed in XBRL? What are the tools available? And we're going to send this presentation out so you can see all these questions, but there's just a range of questions that have come up over the last few months. For filers that have been working in XBRL for the past 10 or so years, starting with risk return on the 40X side, N2s in the last year, now we're looking at a whole range of new clients that are looking at this for the first time and don't get the benefit of the 15 business day grace period that used to exist for mutual funds. Now it's right there. The inline tag content needs to be part of the HTML, as Scott said, and it has to be filed by your definite effective date, or you're out of SEC compliance. And we'll talk about that in more detail. Scott has already talked about the last bullet point. How is XBRL being used? Who's using it? And there's a range of uses and users for the XBRL data. Michelle, if you don't mind, going to the next slide. So what are the elements of the rule? Beginning January of 2023, variable product issuers, we're going to be required to file, and we're going to skip over N3 because the majority of you are issuing N4s and N6s. So we're going to speak predominantly about annuities and life products. We'll begin to be required to file their last pre-effective amendment for any new product going effective after January 1st, and then correspondingly, all annual updates filed on 485B POS. The thing to keep in mind here is the process begins with the registration statement. Much like the way the SEC rolled out mutual funds risk return, until you have tagged a registration statement, so let's just say a post-effective under 485B, any 497s or any definitive information that updates the required tag sections, which we'll get into in a little bit more detail, is not required to be tagged. So let's look at a standard annual update season. May 1, or right around May 1, you're going to file your 485B for your May 1, 2023 prospectuses. If there's a product, a contract in there that is required to be tagged, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail, that is when your XBRL tagging begins. If you have a sticker that's going to file between January 1 and May 1, that will not be required to be tagged until your first registration is tagged, because it needs something to key off of what has changed in the interactive data that allows the machines to be able to identify that content change. The benefit of iXBRL versus traditional XBRL, which the mutual fund space adopted back in 2011, is it is both machine and human readable. As Scott showed you on the screenshot, and Mike is going to show you in more detail, you're actually looking at the HTML, but the content has been tagged, and there's fields that show what is tagged content versus not. Next slide, please. So what needs to be tagged? In a change from the proposal, only contracts that are being sold to new investors need to be tagged. So it's the post-effectives we just talked about, the last pre-effective prior to going effective for a new product, or any changes to any of the sections that need to be tagged in a 497 C or E after the initial tagging and then ongoing from there. The original proposal required all registrations to be tagged. But because of comments that were received from the proposal to the final release, the SEC did yield to those comments and decided that only products that are currently being offered for new investors, new first dollar investors, would need to be tagged, because they felt the benefit of the content being tagged would apply more so to those new investors than to a contract that is no longer being sold. That does not change the requirement of that post-effective filing that became pursuant to 498A last year. So if you're filing a registration, you did not Great West the product prior to the Great West deadline of July 2020, you still have to file the registration. You only have to tag the prospectuses that are still being actively sold. And what does that mean? It means potentially in a framework where you have multiple prospectuses within the same registration, only the prospectuses that are still being issued have to be tagged. The other prospectuses do not. So Michelle, if you can go to the next slide, please. So as I said, the position that the SEC took, that the benefit to the inline tagging would be used primarily for initial investment decisions, where the tag data would be more readily beneficial and be able to be identified within that machine readable content that helps drive investment decisions. So the SEC felt that tagging of only those contracts would become beneficial. Anything that's existing, no longer being sold, they felt the long range benefits would not be beneficial when you look at it from a price point perspective and the cost of creating XBRL versus not, and where the maximum benefit would be derived. Next slide, please. So what do variable product issuers need to do to be in compliance? First and foremost, we talked about this already, and I keep highlighting because it's probably one of the more important aspects of the rule. Only contracts that are being sold to new investors need to be tagged. The items that need to be tagged, the SEC feels are beneficial because they drive decision makers and decision making. So key features, costs and risks are content that the SEC deemed as suitable for being tagged in a structured format. If you look at the third main bullet, those are the items, and we'll talk about that in more detail on the next slide. The key information table, the KIT, fee tables, principal risks, death benefits, other benefits, the underlying fund information for the portfolio companies available under the contract. Those are the items that will need to be tagged only in those new contracts. The good news, the SEC is not introducing any other form types into this requirement. For those of you that have any insight into the closed-end space, there was a whole range of form types that fell under closed-end filers, closed-end and BDCs, that introduced new form types that had to be tagged. In the VIP space, it's only your 485B for those annual updates, the last pre-effective for any new product going effective in the coming years, so after January 1st, and correspondingly any 497s. The 497 VPI, which is the initial summary prospectus, the 497 VPU, the updating summary prospectus, do not need to be tagged. It's all driven off the registration and anything that has changed from the registration. Then the last item on this slide, as I mentioned, for those registration statements that have multiple contracts or multiple prospectuses contained within, if there is a mix between products that are being actively sold versus products that are not being sold, it's only the prospectuses that are being actively sold that need to be tagged. Let's use an example of variable product 1. It was sold. It's no longer being sold. Variable product 2 is the replacement prospectus, or for investors who invested prior to a certain date, then there's the investors who invested after a certain date. So that contract is being offered later. It is the contract that's being later offered later that would be tagged. The previous contract would not. So what this introduces, and Nikki's going to talk about this a little bit during the workflow, is allowing your service team to partner with you, allowing the identification, so letting that team work with you and saying, this prospectus needs to be tagged, this one doesn't. Or in the case, obviously, if there's multiple prospectuses within a registration, all needing to be tagged, identifying that as well. The one point that I wanted to bring up here that ties back to what Scott said earlier is there's the taxonomy, there's the schema, there's the, the instance file, the schema and the helper files, which are the link bases. There can only be one version of that within a filing. So that means there's only one XBRL package, as we call it, that can be contained within that registration. And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we go into the next slides. Michelle, next slide, please. So here are the items. When we look at the N4s and N6s, and they do link back to the taxonomy guide, which I'll show you a screenshot on the next slide. The items within the prospectus for the N4s and N6s. And if you look at the taxonomy guide, which we're going to show you a screenshot of next, the sections within the taxonomy guide that tie back to the items within the prospectus. And you can see there's some commonality between the N4 and N6, but you could also see there's some variations when you look at item 10, for instance, where it's benefits available under the N4, standard death benefits under the N6. One other thing to speak to, and Mike will talk about this in more detail, is, as Scott said, let your service provider lead you. Let them provide the benefits and the information you need. But the taxonomy is structured in a way where certain elements within the taxonomy tie back to an N4 or an N6. So whereas it's a little bit more complicated than risk return was, which had about 225 elements within the taxonomy, the VIP taxonomy has just shy of 500 elements. There are identifications within the taxonomy that drive effectiveness and drive accuracy, which Mike will talk about in a little bit more detail. And Michelle, the next slide, please. This is just a screenshot of the taxonomy guide. So if you think back to the last slide, it talked about item 2, which is the key information within the prospectus. I'm sorry, I said it wrong the second time. Item 6, which is key information within the prospectus. This is an example of what the key information links would look like. What's the element? What's the information? What is it key back to? Item 4, which is the fee table, how does it tie back? And if you look at the screenshot, you can see in the definition text relation to N3, N4, and 6, which makes it easier for your service provider to identify the proper tag, the proper element that needs to be associated with your content to make sure it's tagged correctly. Because as Scott said, accurate tagging is probably the most important element of this when you look at compliance. Timeliness, filing on time, one of the things we didn't talk about, but it's a key ingredient. The SEC has said over the years, and they apply this here, if you do not file your 485B on time with inline tag content, what it does is it prohibits you from filing registration statements moving forward, until you become current and get your XBRL tagged and up to date. So that's one of the elements to take into consideration when you look at the importance of XBRL and what it drives. Think about your timeliness factor, think about the time required, which we'll go into a little bit more detail with Nikki, but also realize that the XBRL is being used. It's being used by the SEC, it's being used by all the other organizations that Scott talked about, and it is being used by analysts. Michelle, I turn it back to you.
Guy, thank you so much. We're going to take a couple of CPE questions right now. And so again, for those of you who are looking for CPE credit, please make sure that you respond to the poll question that appears up here. We're also starting to get some questions in, and I realized that I forgot to mention that we will take questions through the program. Please click on the Q&A link that you see on your console and just key your question in there, and we'll take it when we have little breaks. So let's start with the first poll question here. So which U.S. federal agency has adopted XBRL for entities reporting to it? Is it the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, the Department of Education, or the Office of Management and Budget? Which of these agencies has adopted XBRL for entities reporting to it? And we'll take about 60 seconds for each question. Okay, we just have about another 15 seconds on this question. All right, we're going to be closing down this poll. And we'll go to our second question. Okay. So every XBRL concept has properties such as, does a concept have a property such as a unit, data type, or balance type? Which of these three items is always a property of an XBRL concept? Just about another 30 seconds here. Okay, we're going to close down this poll, and I think we have a couple of questions. So let's just take these questions quickly. I don't want to run out of time here, but the first question is, I'm curious if either of the panelists have any thoughts on when a contract might be a generational difference that has to be tagged versus a no longer sold contract. For example, if a new variant of a contract was released with different fee rates, but is sold under the same product name and prospectus, is the prior version a no longer sold contract, or is that just considered a generational issue? I think, Guy, if you have an answer to that one, that's kind of a tricky one.
It is. I would tie it back to what is it being sold? Is there new investment? Is there first dollar sales? If that doesn't answer the question, then I'm going to have to say, go to your counsel and go to the examiner to ask that question. But I would always tie it back to, are there new first dollar sales coming into the product? And if so, then it would need to be tagged.
Great, thank you. And one last question. Just want to confirm that for variable annuities, only the statutory prospectus and 497 supplements to the statutory prospectus must include iXBRL tags. The question is, the ISP and USP do not require any iXBRL tags?
That is correct. They do not. It all ties back to the full prospectus within the registration statement. The ISP and USP do not need to be tagged. So the forms that they file under 497, the two 497 filing types, VPI and VPU, do not need to be tagged.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so let's move on. We're going to move on to XBRL tagging demonstration, and I'm going to actually stop sharing. Or should I show a couple of slides first, Mike, or do we go straight to demonstration?
Yeah, Michelle, why don't you, there's just 2 slides, so you can go ahead and show them. We'll go through those quickly.
Okay, great. So I'm turning this over to Mike Boyle from Donnelly Financial Solutions.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Good evening as well for some of you. So we're going to, Scott and Guy have really set the stage very well for what we're going to look at. We're going to take a look at what the SEC has provided, where to find them, how to use them, and some key points along the way. Next slide, Michelle. As you'll see, the SEC basically provided 2 flavors of samples. They provided segments of samples, the different sections which Guy was talking about, such as the fee table, the risks, the portfolio, and then they've provided that in its entirety. So the example we're going to go through is going to be the one in its entirety, but there is some value to the smaller ones, which we'll look at as we get into it. Along the way, we'll do a little more on how to navigate the viewer. Scott gave a little preview of that, how to navigate the taxonomy, and some key tagging points and considerations. So I am going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so what I'd like to start with is this here. This is the VIP taxonomy guide, which Guy was mentioning. And you'll see here what I was just speaking to. There are 17 samples containing only the tagging related to a single item, such as what you see down here: key information, fee table, risks, benefits, investment options. And then there are 3 samples which tie those all together. So I am going to move over and show you here. Those samples can be downloaded and uploaded to a viewer. The viewers, all the viewers, including the SECs, are based on RL. I think Nikki's going to have a little more of that when I turn it over to her. But here you can see those samples. You can see there's a sample of just the key information table, the fee table, the risks, the benefits. But what we're going to start off with is this one. Well, let me go back. I should point out that the ones that say all are the samples that tie them all together. So this will give you a sample top to bottom of a complete registration statement with all the sections which Guy outlined. Now, before we do that, the taxonomy was mentioned a number of times, both by Scott and Guy. So let me go over to that. One point that Scott mentioned was regarding documentation. And in previous taxonomies, such as risk return and gap, there would be a sentence or 2 describing what each tag meant. However, for VIP, if you look at column K here, the SEC decided not to provide that. So when something's filed and you click on a tag, or when you're reviewing it before it gets filed, you are not going to see documentation. What you're going to see, and I'll pick something and I'll click on it here, is what Scott was talking about. The SEC will point you to the authoritative documentation where you could find out more about that particular tag or that item. Now, we as a group at XBRL US we kind of objected to that and tried to get them to include definitions because it's much more user-friendly than sending users and registrants off to read the literature. But this is what we have. So that's going to make this here, what we're looking at, the samples, very important. Now, for those of you who are brand new to XBRL, I will tell you that the viewer might seem a little daunting at first, but it's really very user-friendly. And I think after you spend just a little bit of time with it, you will get comfortable with it. They did a very good job putting this viewer together. So one thing I'd like to point out, Scott mentioned how the items that are highlighted in orange are tagged facts. Okay, for example, document type, N4, period. Okay, over here on the top right, where you see where it says facts 390, those are the number of tagged facts in this job. And you can click on that and open and close it. And here you see all your tagged facts. And there's 39 pages of them, 10 facts on each page. Now, keep in mind, this does not mean 390 different tags. It means 390 different facts. And what I mean by that is you can see here a number of tags get used multiple times, such as risk text block. So we have 390 unique facts. Okay, so if we were to scroll through this, one thing you will keep an eye out for when you are reviewing this, once your vendor tags your data, they will return either a zip file to you, or they will point you to where in their viewer you can go in and review your tag document. And each section will have a top level tag such as this. So here we have key fees and expenses text block. And if we click on this contract expand, you will see what all is included in that tag. And it's the entirety of the fees and the expenses section. So over here on the left, if we scroll down in the attribute dialog box first, and then we'll scroll down here. So it's captured all of this right up through withdrawals. Then we go to risks, and you'll see similarly risks table text block. And what that will have is the entirety of your risk section, okay? So you will find a tag like that as you get into each new section. Here's your fee table text block. That'll have the entirety of your fees section. Annual contract expenses, same thing, okay? So you're gonna have that top level either text block or table text block tag for each section in your N4 or your N6 all the way through. Now, within these tables and within these sections, you will also see items highlighted. These are your detail tags, okay? So if we were to click on this first one here, this 12,460. The tag being used there is surrender expense 1 year maximum dollars. Now, this is an example of how in many cases the tags are actually very user-friendly and very logical. Because if you look at the name of that tag, that's exactly what we're dealing with here, right? So this is, if you read the content, if you surrender 1 year maximum. Surrender 1 year maximum. And you will see that throughout. Here's surrender 1 year minimum. Okay, and then you have the same thing for if you annuitized expense 1 year maximum dollars. And in this third part of the table, where it says if you do not surrender. and the tagging is named very similar. One thing I'll point out here, for those of you who have any familiarity with risk return, this is very much like the redemption, no redemption setup in risk return. So that's one of the very good and useful parts of the taxonomy is the file naming. Here's another section, same thing. Do not surrender, surrender, and annuitize. And the reason there's multiple tables here, here's another one, is that these all deal with different classes. So this table is Class C, this one here is Class L, the next one is Class A, Class E. And the way you deal with that is you will see there is a member for that particular class. And a member, as I believe Scott spoke to, is just another way to differentiate and identify a fact. So very common XBRL concept. If we go a little further down, keep in mind here, if I go back up for a second into the key information table, there is a risk section. Be mindful that there are two different risk sections. This section up here are the risks associated with your key information table. Down here, the risks we're looking at, these are your principal risks. So they are different, and there are different tags for them. Now, each specific risk needs to be identified. So if we click on risk of loss, and again, keep your eye on the attribute dialog box, which is this thing here, as I click on different facts, risk of loss. So all these different risks are going to use this tag, but in order to differentiate them, you need a member. And the taxonomy has provided a few of them. So where you see VIP, that means it's part of the taxonomy. So they provided a member for risk of loss. They provided a member for not short-term investment. However, now we're down to conflicts of interest, and you could see this is not VIP. So that means the taxonomy has not provided it. It will have to be created. It's very likely after we get through a year or two of VIP filings, the SEC will add additional risks because the less customization in XBRL, the better. So be aware of that. Benefits. Now you're getting into probably a more complicated part of the tagging. You will have, in the first column, you'll have your name of benefit, right? I'm going to skip over to your third column where you will have the standard benefit tag, which if it is, it's true. Optional, same thing, optional benefit tag, true. Let me get over to Nikki quickly in a minute here, but let me just move down to the portfolio. And we'll end with that. So again, with the portfolio, you'll have your portfolio company objective. That tag will be used for every row. In your portfolio and advisor, sub-advisor, three possibilities. Well, one, you're always going to have your actual portfolio. Okay, have that here, here, here in each row. You will then have your portfolio company advisor, for which there's a tag. And in the event you have a sub-advisor, which we have right here, there is also a tag for that. So be mindful of that. The other thing you will see here on each row, there is going to be a separate and different member to identify the portfolio company in question. And whether you're dealing with an N3, an N4, an N6, mostly N4s and N6s, as Guy mentioned, your last taggable part will be the portfolio. Last thing I want to mention before we go to Nikki, I mentioned there is some usefulness for just these sections. So I'm going to open one up. And what that is, if you go to the very end of any of these sections, there's a list of every tag that's used in that particular section. So by being in a section that just has one part of it, you're only going to get a list of the tags used in that section, which is a little more useful than at the end of the all document, where it's going to list every single tag. So that's a quick overview of the viewer, the taxonomy, and the SEC provided N4. And I think, Nikki, if you are ready, I will stop sharing and we'll turn it over to you.
Mike, thanks very much. Yeah, this is Michelle here. I'm going to start sharing my screens now and turn it over to Nikki. And I just want to, I apologize, everybody. We're running a little bit late because we have so much content to cover. And so bear with us if we, hopefully you can stay with us for a little bit longer than top of the hour here. And so, Nikki, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you very much, Michelle. So hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I will be discussing the adjustments that you will need to append to your current workflow. And my goal here is to also alert you to the essential and authoritative resources that will guide you to a successful compliance with this mandate. Okay, next slide, please. So first, it is important to note that you will need to append your current workflow to incorporate the XBRL tagging requirements. So once your books are ready to be tagged, you want to set aside significant time to tag, as it will require a significant effort. You will want to ensure that you review all your inline tags and document a sign-off as well. Next, you want to ensure you have reviewed the complete SEC filing package, which includes the primary official filing, the XBRL link bases, and exhibits. So the entire SEC filing package should be reviewed. Lastly, I highly recommend test filing frequently and as early as possible with the SEC prior to your live filing, and address any errors and warnings that are identified in the test submission results. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, now let's take a deeper dive into the XBRL review component. First, you will want to confirm the DEI information is tagged correctly and includes the required elements as defined in the Edgar Filer Manual. Next, review your element selections and dimensional members to ensure each tag accurately represents the fact that it is applied to. You will need to review all labels and ensure compliance with the VIP taxonomy guide, which states that only numeric elements beginning with the word other should have custom labels. All numbers must be consistent with your books. Context dates should be consistent with the prospectus date, and all calculations should be defined where applicable. And it is very important that you have a documented process to perform a completeness check. So as Guy mentioned earlier, You want to ensure you have tagged all the required disclosure items as he highlighted in the slide titled sections in the prospectus to be tagged. This is actually a very helpful slide that can help outline your completeness check documentation. But you can, of course, also find the details in the VIP taxonomy guide. Another important step in the completeness check, though, is to keep track of your fact count. So Mike also demonstrated this earlier when he presented the inline rendering. And if you recall, in the top right hand corner, you had the fact count. You want to keep track of that fact count, right? So ensure that it is moving in the same direction as you would expect it. So if you have a significant drop in fact count, but you've added facts or you've added disclosures required to be tagged, that should be a big red indicator that something went wrong. So just make sure you keep track. These are things that can really help in your review process. And finally, review, document, and track all EFM validation results and the Edgar test filing results. Okay, next slide, Michelle. Okay, now I'm going to get a little technical, but it's important to know EFM section 5.2.5.12, which provides guidance surrounding the inline XBRL transformation registries supported by the Edgar system. So the transformation rules registry defines the permitted strings of text disclosed in your inline XBRL filing that is going to be converted into data types that are attributed to elements disclosed in your XBRL instance document. Also, the SEC provides specific transformations that will work in tandem with the transformation rules registry that validates your inline XBRL filings. So you'll see a warning message that I have coded here when you are filing with facts that are not transformed properly. Okay, Michelle, you can go to the next slide, please. Now, section 6.3.2 outlines the EFM outlines the XBRL attachments to an Edgar submission. So registrants must identify their interactive data files as Exhibit 101 in the exhibit index, and the registrant is required to include the word inline to reference in the title description of any of these exhibits. So it's just important to understand how you're going to represent these inline XBRL requirements or attachments. They will be as exhibits. These interactive data files will be presented as Exhibit 101 in your exhibit index, and you want to make sure you refer to the word or you include the word inline in the title description. Next slide. Okay, you will notice throughout most of the previous slides, I have referenced the Edgar Filer Manual. It should be leveraged as your primary authoritative source for compliance. But I will note the language is very technical in nature, so it is important to add a number of other authoritative resources to your arsenal. And we will highlight those in a few. But in the EFM Volume 2, Section 6, you will find an extensive discussion on the interactive data. So throughout this entire section are rules that can impact your filing. But I have provided a few very specific examples here that speak specifically to filing Form N3, N4, and N6. But again, throughout the entire section of Volume 2, Section 6, these rules can impact your filing. So though it's a very technical document, technical language, it's important to know why we are referencing it consistently, because it is the authoritative guidance, and it should be referred to throughout your compliance. Okay, next slide. All right, as I promised, here's a list of authoritative resources that I recommend you rely on for guidance and check in regularly for updates. First up, the EFM is it is regularly updated to conform with any Edgar releases. So the SEC will update the Edgar system. They will update the EFM to conform with that Edgar release. So you will see updates to the EFM represented in draft forms with red lines prior to a publication. Okay. Also, the SEC provides staff observations, guidance, and trend analysis on all structured data. The SEC monitors your compliance with the XBRL requirements, and this website should be really monitored to ensure you keep up to date on any new SEC observations. The SEC also provides registrants with staff interpretations and FAQs as it relates to your interactive data disclosure rules. And these FAQs really do help filers understand how to comply with these rules. So definitely want to keep track of those. I've also provided a link to the location where the SEC publishes the standard taxonomies, in addition to where you can download the XBRL software to render your inline XBRL filings. It's highly recommended that you stay up to date with these authoritative resources. So I'm actually going to highlight these a little bit further here. Next slide. So it's important to ensure, I mentioned this earlier in a previous slide, but it's important to ensure you have tagged the document and entity information, or the DEI elements, as you've defined as it is defined in the rules of the EFM and provided to us in the SEC's VIP taxonomy guide. So you want to ensure you tag the registrant name, the CIK, the amendment flag, and the amendment description should the amendment flag be true, the document type, the investment company, and the investment company type. So that is 5 DI elements always required, and 6 should you be filing an amendment. This list could change. So, it's okay. No, it's fine. This list could change. So it's, this is how it stands as of today, and how it's defined in the EFM. But it could change. So, just want to note that it's not like this is the static list forever. This is how it's currently quoted in the EFM. And we always want to keep track and monitor that EFM to see if this changes over time. Okay, next slide. Okay, now diving into the authoritative resources, we have the SEC's website for publication of the standard taxonomies. This is a screenshot of the standard taxonomy as it applies to the VIP. So you can see here we have a host of information, the release notes, sample SEC inline XBRL files, and the taxonomy guide are all found here, along with the taxonomy itself and the additional schemas. Next slide. I'm trying to move it along. I want to also highlight the SEC staff observations again. So given that this is a new ruling, it is highly likely you will see new FAQs on the VIP taxonomy or general questions on the interpretation of the final rules. So you want to check back in on this on this site here. Next slide, please. And lastly, for rendering your inline XBRL, REL is an open source platform used by the SEC staff and the SEC viewers. So a REL will enable the rendering of your inline XBRL files, and they will aid in your review. So that's a free download for you to render those inline XBRL files and review. I really recommend that you save all of the links that we have incorporated throughout this entire webinar and set them as your favorites, because you might find yourself frequently using them. But with that, thank you very much for your time, and I wish you all a successful compliance with this mandate. Back to you, Michelle.
Great, Nikki, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you, and I apologize for running a little bit over here. We're going to run through a couple of CPE questions now, our final CPE questions. Okay, and you should be able to see this up on your screen. The new SEC rule for variable product issuers is effective on which date? Is it January 23rd, 2023, January 1st, 2023, or March 31st, 2023? Okay, so we'll just take another 30 seconds. Okay, just like another 10 seconds, so we'll go to our final poll question. And we are getting a question about how do we get a copy of the deck and materials. We will be posting the replay and the slides themselves sometime in the next couple of days. So I'm going to end that poll and go to our final poll. Okay, what change from the original proposed rule did the SEC make in their final rule? Is it that reporting entities are no longer required to use inline XBRL to tag reported facts? Is it that the rule only applies to contracts sold to new investors? Or is it that the timing of compliance deadlines change from the original proposal? Which of those is the change from the original proposed rule? And just another 30 seconds here. Okay, just another 15 seconds. Okay, I'm going to close this poll down. And again, I apologize for running a little bit over. There's just so much information to convey here. I want to thank all of our speakers, Guy, Scott, Mike, Nikki. Everybody did a phenomenal job, and we really appreciate your participation. We did get one question. I know that many of you probably need to run off to other meetings, but we have one question I just want to throw out to the panel. If you have XBRL registration statement and the product then becomes in force, do you still have to XBRL file a 497 filing until the next registration statement filing? Does that, I'm not sure if I'm reading that question correctly.
That question has come up a lot, Michelle. That's a great question.
Mm-hmm.
I think it ties to when is the product going to be effective. So if it's effective prior to January 1st, 2023, it's declared effective, then you would not be required to do your next XBRL or your first XBRL when you filed your next registration. That has come up a lot. That's why you see a lot of filers with new products are trying to go effective before New Year's Eve. So they won't have to worry about XBRL until May 1. That is our belief, but to be honest, we do have a question out there to get clarification. Mike, I don't know if you want to add to that.
No, I think you covered it in its entirety, Guy.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you all very much. And Scott too. I think I forgot to mention Scott. Really appreciate everybody's input. Hopefully this was valuable for everyone. Again, both the slides as a PDF with all of the links embedded that have been talked about today, those will be made available along with a replay for the entire session. So those will be up sometime in the next couple of days, and you will get an email about that as well. So again, thank you for joining us, and thank you to all of our speakers. And we're probably going to have some additional webinars later this year before year end, believe it or not. And we'll get back to you on those shortly. Thanks again, and see you on our next webinar.
Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.